My name is Lisa Miller, and I was 15 years old when my family fell apart in the worst way imaginable. It all started with my dad's idea to take us on a family trip to the Ozark Mountains. He said it would fix everything. His drinking, my mom's anger, my brother Kevin's rebellion, and the silence that had grown between all of us. But looking back now, I know it was doomed from the start. We drove into the Devil's Backbone region in Dad's newest purchase, a big, boxy RV he called the Winnebago Brave. He'd bought it with money we didn't have, saying it would bring us closer together. Mom wasn't happy about it. She barely spoke during the drive, staring out the window with her arms crossed. Kevin had his headphones on, blasting music so loud I could hear it from the back seat. I sat quietly sketching in my notebook, trying to ignore the tension. The road twisted and turned through dense forests covered in mist. The trees were tall and dark, their bare branches reaching out like claws. It was unseasonably cold for early. Winter and frost clung to the edges of the RV windows. Dad kept saying how beautiful it was, but I couldn't see anything beautiful about it. It felt lonely and strange, like we didn't belong there. After hours of driving, we finally reached a small clearing deep in the woods. There were no signs, or markers to tell us where we were. It was just an open space surrounded by trees so thick you couldn't see beyond them. Dad parked the RV and stepped outside, clapping his hands together like he'd just won a prize. "This is perfect," he said with a grin. "Fresh air, peace, and quiet, just what we need." Mom sighed and climbed out reluctantly. "Jack, are you sure this is safe? There's no one around." "That's the point," Dad replied cheerfully. "No distractions." Kevin muttered something under his breath as he kicked at a rock near the RV door. I stayed inside for a moment longer, staring out at the misty forest. Something about it made my stomach twist, a feeling I couldn't explain. When I finally stepped out, I noticed something odd right away. There was another campsite nearby, but it looked abandoned. Rusty equipment from decades ago was scattered. Around, a broken lantern, an old cooler with peeling paint, and even some toys half buried in the dirt. One of them was a doll missing its head. "Creepy," Kevin said as he picked up the doll and tossed it aside. Mom shook her head. "Jack, we should leave." Dad waved her off. "Relax, it's just some old junk." I wandered closer to the abandoned campsite and saw something that made me stop. A small diary lying near one of the broken chairs. It was faded and water-damaged, but I could still make out some of the writing inside. The first page had a name scrawled across it. Emily Hartman. Beneath that were words written in shaky handwriting. "The hungry man is watching." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Lisa," Mom called sharply, "don't touch that." Quickly put the diary down and backed away. As if things couldn't get worse, we heard a loud crack behind us. A tree had fallen across the narrow dirt road we'd driven in on. It blocked our only way out. "Well," Dad said with forced optimism, "looks like we're staying here for a while." Mom glared at him but didn't say anything else. That night, as we settled into the RV for dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about that diary or the abandoned campsite. Something about this place felt wrong, like we weren't alone. Jack looked at his family, forcing a smile as the mist swallowed the trees around them. "This is going to be good for us," he said, but no one answered. My dad always had a way of pretending everything was fine, even when it wasn't. That night, he tried his best to make us feel like this trip was going to fix everything. He pulled out a deck of cards and suggested we play together. Mom didn't want to. Kevin rolled his eyes, and I just sat there sketching in my notebook. Eventually, Dad gave up and went outside to check on the RV's heater. It was freezing. Even inside the RV, I could see my breath in the air. The heater had been working earlier, but now it was blowing cold air. Dad cursed under his breath as he fiddled with it. "Just needs a little adjustment," he said, but I could tell he didn't know what he was doing. Mom sat at the tiny table with her arms crossed, staring out the window into the misty darkness. "Jack, this isn't safe," she said quietly. "We should have stayed home." Dad didn't answer her. He kept working on the heater like his life depended on it. Kevin had gone to his bunk with his headphones on, blasting music so loud I could hear it through the thin walls of the RV. I stayed near Mom, sketching in my notebook and trying not to think about how strange this place felt. That's when I heard it, the whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing through the trees outside, but then I realized it wasn't random noise. It sounded like words, faint and far away, like someone calling out from deep in the woods. Lisa. I froze, my pencil hovering above the page. The voice was soft but clear, and it sounded like my name. Lisa. I looked at Mom, but she hadn't heard it. She was still staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts. I stood up and walked toward Kevin's bunk. "Did you hear that?" I asked him. He pulled off his headphones and frowned at me. "Hear what?" Someone's whispering outside. Kevin rolled his eyes. "It's probably Dad muttering to himself." But it wasn't Dad. I could see him through the window, still crouched by the heater. I didn't say anything else and went back to my seat. The whispering had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there in the mist. Later that night, after we'd all gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. The RV felt too cold even with blankets piled on top of me. Kevin's music had stopped playing hours ago, and everything was quiet except for the occasional creak of the RV settling into the ground. I stared at the ceiling and tried to calm myself down. Maybe I'd imagined the whispering earlier. It could have been anything. Wind, animals, my own nerves playing tricks on me. But then I heard something else. A soft tapping sound coming from outside. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud enough to wake anyone else up, but it was steady and deliberate, like someone knocking gently on the side of the RV. I held my breath and listened closely. The tapping moved, first near my window, then closer to Kevin's bunk. Tap, tap, tap. I wanted to wake someone up, Mom or Dad or even Kevin, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, in place as fear gripped me tightly. Then came another sound, a laugh. It was faint, almost like a child giggling far away in the woods. It sent chills down my spine because it didn't belong here. There were no children around for miles. The tapping stopped after that, and everything went silent again. The next morning, as we sat around eating breakfast, or trying to, everything tasted stale. I told Mom what I'd heard during the night. She frowned at me but didn't dismiss it right away like she usually did when Kevin or Dad said something strange. "I don't like this place," she said finally. "Jack, we need to leave." Dad shook his head as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "We can't leave. The road's blocked." "Then move the tree," Mom snapped at him. "It's too big," Dad replied calmly. "We'll figure something out." Kevin rolled his eyes again and muttered under his breath about how ridiculous this whole trip was. But I noticed something odd about him. He looked tired, more tired than usual. His eyes were red like he hadn't slept at all last night. "You okay?" I asked him quietly. He shrugged without looking at me. "Fine." But he wasn't fine. I could tell something was bothering him too. Lisa held the diary tightly as she stared out the fogged window of the RV. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard a child laughing. The next day, things got worse. Much worse. I woke up to the sound of Dad cursing loudly outside the RV. I climbed out of my bunk and saw Mom already up, standing by the window with her arms crossed. Kevin was still in bed, his blanket pulled over his head like he didn't want to deal with any of it. "What's going on?" I asked as I rubbed my eyes. Mom didn't answer right away. She just nodded toward the window. "Your dad's trying to figure out why all the food went bad." I walked over and looked outside. Dad was crouched next to the cooler we'd brought, pulling out cans and packages of food. Everything looked wrong. The canned goods were covered in mold, even though they were sealed. The bread was green and fuzzy, and the fruit had turned black overnight. That doesn't make any sense, I said quietly. It was fine yesterday. Mom didn't reply, but I could tell she was thinking the same thing I was. Something wasn't right about this place. Dad stormed back into the RV, slamming the door behind him. I don't know what happened, he said, running a hand through his hair. It's like everything spoiled at once. We need to leave, Mom said firmly. Now. Dad sighed and shook his head. I told you, we can't. That tree is blocking the road. Then move it, she snapped. I tried. It's too heavy to move by myself. Then we'll all help, Mom said, her voice rising. Kevin groaned from his bunk. Can you two stop yelling? It's too early for this. You're getting up, Mom said sharply, turning to him. We're leaving today. Kevin muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. We all went outside to look at the fallen tree. It was massive, thick and heavy, with branches that stretched across the entire dirt road. Even with all of us pushing together, it wouldn't budge. It's no use, Dad said finally, wiping sweat from his forehead. We're stuck here until I can figure something else out. Mom looked furious, but she didn't say anything else. She just turned and walked back toward the RV. Kevin kicked at a rock on the ground and muttered, Great. Just great. I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the tree. Something about it bothered me. Not just its size, but how it had fallen perfectly across the road like it had been placed there on purpose. As we headed back to the RV, I noticed something else. The mist was thicker than before. It clung to everything, the trees, the ground, even the air around us, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. By afternoon, we were all on edge. The cold had crept into every corner of the RV despite Dad's efforts to fix the heater again. We tried eating what little food we had left, some crackers and peanut butter that hadn't spoiled, but it wasn't enough to keep us full. And then there was Kevin. He'd been acting strange all day, quieter than usual, which wasn't like him at all. He kept staring out the window like he was looking for something in the mist. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shrugged and said he was tired. But later that night I found out what was really going on. It started when I woke up to a soft creaking sound coming from Kevin's bunk. At first, I thought he was just tossing and turning in his sleep, but then I realized he wasn't in his bed at all. I sat up and looked around the RV. The door was slightly open, letting in a thin stream of cold air. Kevin, I whispered. No answer. I climbed out of my bunk and stepped outside into the freezing night air. The mist was so thick I could barely see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. Kevin? I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. And then I saw him, standing at the edge of the clearing near the trees. He wasn't moving. He just stood there with his back to me, staring into the woods. Kevin! I shouted as I ran toward him. When I got closer, he finally turned around, and what I saw made my blood run cold. His eyes were wide and glassy like he wasn't really awake. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. What are you doing out here? I asked him, trying to keep my voice steady. I heard them, he said softly. Heard who? The voices, he replied, looking back toward the woods. They're calling me. There's no one out there, I said quickly, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the trees. Come back inside. He didn't resist as I led him back to the RV, but he kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone, or something, to follow us. When we got inside, Mom woke up and immediately started asking questions. Where had Kevin been? Why had he gone outside? But Kevin didn't answer her. He just climbed into his bunk without saying another word. Dad tried to brush it off as sleepwalking. Kids do that sometimes, he said, but Mom wasn't convinced. Neither was I. That night, as we all tried to go back to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in those woods, that something out there was watching us and waiting. Jack slammed his fist on the steering wheel as the RV circled back to the same spot for the third time. We're not leaving, he muttered under his breath. Part 4. hunger and despair. The next morning, everything felt different. Heavier, colder, and quieter. The mist had thickened so much that it was like a wall surrounding the RV. No matter where I looked, I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. It felt like the forest was closing in on us. Mom was the first to notice something strange about Kevin. He hadn't gotten out of bed yet, which wasn't unusual for him, but when she tried to wake him up, he didn't respond right away. When he finally sat up, his face looked pale and his eyes were dull, almost lifeless. "Kevin, are you feeling okay?" Mom asked, her voice soft but worried. "I'm fine," he muttered without looking at her, but he wasn't fine. His movements were slow, like he was dragging himself through molasses. He barely touched the crackers we'd set out for breakfast, even though we were all starving. Dad tried to lighten the mood like he always did. "All right, team," he said with forced cheerfulness. "We're going to figure this out today. No more sitting around. We're going to find a way out of here." Mom didn't say anything, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe him anymore, not after everything that had already gone wrong. Dad decided to take the RV out again to see if we could find another way around the fallen tree. He said it would only take a few minutes, but when he came back an hour later, his face was pale and sweaty. "What happened?" Mom asked as he climbed back into the RV. "We're stuck," Dad said quietly. "I drove for miles, or at least I thought I did, but no matter which direction I went, I kept ending up back here." "That's impossible," Mom said sharply. "I don't know how else to explain it," Dad replied, running a hand through his hair. "It's like the road loops back on itself." Mom stared at him for a long moment before turning away without saying anything else. The rest of the day passed in silence. None of us knew what to do anymore. The hunger was getting worse, gnawing at our stomachs like a wild animal, and the cold was unbearable even inside the RV. By evening, Kevin's behavior had gotten even stranger. He kept staring out the window into the mist like he was waiting for something, or someone, to appear. When Mom asked him what he was looking at, he just shrugged and said, "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. I knew that much. Later that night, as we all tried to sleep again, I heard Kevin muttering softly from his bunk. At first, I thought he was talking in his sleep, but then I realized he was awake. I sat up and listened closely. His voice was low and raspy like he was struggling to get the words out. "So hungry," he whispered over and over again. "Kevin," I said quietly. He didn't answer me. He just kept whispering those same two words. "So hungry." I climbed out of my bunk and walked over to him. "Kevin?" I said again as I touched his arm gently. He turned toward me slowly, and what I saw made my heart stop. His eyes weren't normal anymore. They reflected light like an animal's eyes in the dark. His teeth looked sharper too, almost like they'd grown overnight. "Lisa," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so hungry." I backed away from him quickly and ran to wake up Mom and Dad. When they saw Kevin, they froze in place. Mom gasped loudly while Dad just stared at him with wide eyes. "What's happening to him?" Mom whispered. "I don't know," Dad replied shakily, "but we need to do something." Kevin didn't move from his bunk. He just sat there staring at us with those glowing eyes and sharp teeth like he wasn't really Kevin anymore. Lisa whispered to her father, "I don't think Kevin is okay." Jack turned toward his son, who was staring into the mist with a strange smile on his face. The next day, Kevin was gone. I woke up to the sound of Mom shouting his name. Her voice was panicked, and when I sat up, I saw her standing by his empty bunk. The blanket was crumpled at the foot of the bed, and the door to the RV was wide open, letting in the freezing morning air. "Kevin!" she yelled again as she stepped outside into the mist. Dad was already out there looking around the clearing. He couldn't have gone far, he said, but he didn't sound confident. His voice was tight, like he was trying to hold it together. I grabbed my coat and followed them outside. The mist was thicker than ever, swirling around us like it had a life of its own. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and every sound seemed muffled, like the forest was swallowing it. "Kevin!" I called out, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" There was no answer, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the frosty ground. We searched the clearing first, then moved toward the edge of the woods. Mom kept calling his name over and over again, her voice breaking each time. Dad didn't say much. He just kept looking around with a grim expression on his face. And then we found it. Kevin's jacket. It was hanging from a low tree branch near the edge of the forest. The sight of it made my stomach drop. It didn't make any sense. Why would Kevin leave his jacket behind in weather this cold? Mom grabbed it and held it close to her chest like it was all she had left of him. "Jack," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "We have to find him." Dad nodded and stepped into the woods without hesitation. Mom followed him, clutching Kevin's jacket tightly. I hesitated for a moment before going after them. The trees were tall and bare, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground was covered in frost, and every step we took felt louder than it should have been. The mist made it hard to see where we were going, and after a while, everything started to look the same. "Kevin!" Dad called out again, his voice echoing through the trees. For a moment there was silence, and then we heard it. A faint voice calling back. "Dad." It sounded like Kevin. Mom gasped and started running toward the sound. "Kevin, we're here!" But something about the voice didn't feel right. It was too soft, too distant, like it wasn't really coming from him. "Wait!" I yelled after her, but she didn't stop. Dad ran after her, and I had no choice but to follow them deeper into the woods. The voice called out again. "Mom, Dad, Lisa." It sent chills down my spine because now I could hear something else in it. Something unnatural. It wasn't just Kevin's voice anymore. There was something darker underneath it. Something that made my skin crawl. We kept moving toward the sound until we reached a small clearing surrounded by trees. In the center of it stood a figure, a tall, thin shape barely visible through the mist. At first, I thought it was Kevin, but then I saw its antlers. They were long and twisted like branches, and its body looked wrong. Too thin, too stretched out. Its eyes glowed faintly in the mist as it turned toward us. Mom froze in place, clutching Kevin's jacket tightly. Dad stepped in front of her protectively, holding up his hands like he could somehow stop whatever this thing was from coming closer. And then it spoke. Its voice sounded like Kevin's at first. "Help me." But as it spoke again, its tone changed. Deeper now, colder. "Feed me." I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The thing tilted its head slightly as if studying us before taking a slow step forward. Dad grabbed Mom's arm and pulled her back toward me. "Run," he said quietly but firmly. "What about Kevin?" Mom whispered desperately. "We'll find him," Dad said quickly. "But we need to go now." The thing took another step toward us, its glowing eyes locked onto us like a predator, watching its prey. We turned and ran as fast as we could back through the woods toward the RV. The mist seemed thicker now, wrapping around us like it didn't want to let us go. Every step felt harder than the last, as if something was pulling us back toward that clearing. When we finally reached the RV and slammed the door shut behind us, none of us spoke for a long time. Mom sat at the table with Kevin's jacket still, clutched in her hands while Dad paced back and forth silently. I sat on my bunk staring out the window into the misty forest beyond. Somewhere out there was my brother, or at least what used to be him, and I didn't know if we'd ever see him again. Jack froze as a voice called out from behind him. Kevin's voice, but it came from something tall and antlered in the mist. That night, the RV felt colder than ever. The heater wasn't working again, and even with all the blankets piled on top of us, it felt like the chill was coming from inside the walls. Mom sat at the table, staring blankly at Kevin's jacket. Dad was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself about what to do next. I just sat on my bunk, hugging my knees and trying not to cry. We hadn't heard Kevin's voice again since we ran back from the woods, but I couldn't stop thinking about that thing we saw. The tall figure, with antlers and glowing eyes. It had spoken with Kevin's voice, but it wasn't him. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. As the hours dragged on, I started to feel like we were being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I thought I saw shadows moving in the mist, but when I blinked, they were gone. The silence outside was almost worse than the cold. It was so quiet that even the slightest creak of the RV felt deafening. And then we heard it, a knock. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap on the side of the RV. We all froze in place, staring at each other. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Jack, Mom whispered, her voice trembling. What is that? Dad grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the door. Stay here, he said firmly. Don't. Open it, Mom hissed, grabbing his arm. I'm not going to open it, Dad said quietly. I just want to see what's out there. He unlocked the door slowly and cracked it open just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The beam of light cut through the mist, but there was nothing there, just the empty clearing and the trees beyond. Dad closed the door quickly and locked it again. There's nothing out there, he said, but his voice didn't sound convincing. We all tried to settle down after that, but none of us could sleep. Every little sound made us jump, the creak of the RV shifting in the wind, the rustle of branches outside, even our own breathing. And then Kevin came back. It was late, maybe midnight or later, when we heard footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the frosty ground as they approached the RV. We all froze again as a voice called out softly. Mom, Dad, Lisa. It was Kevin's voice. Mom shot up from her seat and ran to the door before Dad could stop her. Kevin, she cried as she unlocked it. Wait, Dad shouted, grabbing her arm just before she could pull the door open. We don't know if it's him. It's our son, Mom yelled back, tears streaming down her face. He's alive. Dad hesitated for a moment before finally unlocking the door and opening it slowly. Kevin stood just outside in the mist, looking pale and tired but otherwise unharmed. He wasn't wearing his jacket anymore, just his thin shirt and jeans, but he didn't seem cold at all. Kevin, Mom cried as she ran to him and pulled him into a hug. He didn't hug her back. He just stood there stiffly with a strange expression on his face, like he wasn't sure what to do. Are you okay? Dad asked cautiously as he stepped closer. I'm fine, Kevin said quietly, his voice flat and emotionless. Something about him felt off. His movements were slow and awkward, like he wasn't used to his own body anymore. And when he looked at me, his eyes seemed different. Darker somehow, like they didn't belong to him. Mom didn't seem to notice anything wrong. She led Kevin back inside and sat him down at the table, fussing over him like she always did when he got sick or hurt. But as I watched him sit there silently, staring down at his hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really Kevin. Not anymore. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed awake, watching him from my bunk. He hadn't moved in hours. He just sat there staring blankly at nothing. And then he turned toward me suddenly, his eyes locking onto mine in the dim light of the RV. I'm hungry, he said softly. His voice sent chills down my spine. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. It didn't sound like Kevin anymore. It sounded deeper and colder than before. I didn't say anything. I couldn't even move. But he kept staring at me with those dark eyes until finally, turning away again. The next morning, things got even worse. Kevin barely spoke or ate anything all day. His skin looked paler than ever, almost gray in some places like frostbite had started to set in. And when Mom tried to touch his arm at one point, he flinched away from her like her touch hurt him. By evening, Dad decided we needed to leave Matter what, even if it meant abandoning the RV and walking out on foot through the woods. But before we could pack up our things, Kevin disappeared again, this time without a sound or warning, and we were left alone in that freezing mist once more. Jack stared at Kevin through the window, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "I'm sorry." Kevin was gone again, and this time none of us had the energy to search for him. The mist outside had grown so thick that it felt like stepping into a wall. The cold seeped into the RV no matter how many blankets we piled on or how tightly we shut the doors. It was like the forest itself wanted us to freeze. Mom sat at the table, her head in her hands. She hadn't said a word since Kevin disappeared again. Dad stood by the window, staring out into the swirling gray mist with a look I'd never seen on his face before. Fear. I stayed in my bunk, curled up with my sketchbook, but I wasn't drawing anymore. My hands were too shaky, and every time I tried to focus, I thought about Kevin, about the way he'd looked when he came back, about how he wasn't himself. And then we heard it again. The knocking. It was louder this time, more forceful, like whoever was outside wanted to be let in immediately. Tap. 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 Mom flinched but didn't move from her seat. Dad grabbed the flashlight again and walked toward the door. "Don't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He glanced back at me but didn't stop. "I have to see what's out there." "No!" Mom cried suddenly, standing up and grabbing his arm. "Jack, don't open that door. It's not Kevin." Dad hesitated for a moment, looking at her with wide eyes. "What if it is?" he said, quietly. "What if he needs our help?" "It's not him," Mom said firmly, her voice trembling. "You saw what he looked like last night. That wasn't our son." The knocking came again, louder this time. Tap, 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 and then we heard his voice. "Dad, Mom, Lisa." It sounded exactly like Kevin, soft and pleading, but there was something wrong with it, something hollow. Dad's grip on the flashlight tightened as he turned back toward the door. "I can't just leave him out there," he said, his voice breaking. "Jack," Mom begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't." But Dad didn't listen. He unlocked the door and swung it open. The mist poured in like smoke, curling around his legs as he stepped outside. For a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of our breathing. And then, we saw him, Kevin, standing just a few feet away in the clearing. "Dad," he said softly, his voice shaking. "I'm so cold." He looked worse than before. His skin was pale and almost translucent, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. His teeth were sharp now, too sharp, and when he smiled at us, it sent chills down my spine. "Kevin," Dad said cautiously as he stepped closer to him. "Are you okay?" Kevin didn't answer right away. He just tilted his head slightly and stared at Dad with those glowing eyes. "I'm hungry," he said finally. Dad froze in place, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "We'll get you something to eat," he said quickly. "Just come inside." But Kevin didn't move. Instead, he smiled wider, and that's when I saw it. The antlers. They were small, at first barely visible above his head, but as I watched in horror they started to grow longer and sharper until they curved like twisted branches. "Jack!" Mom screamed from behind him. "Get back inside." But Dad didn't move fast enough. Kevin, or whatever he'd become, lunged at him with an unnatural speed, knocking him to the ground. The flashlight rolled away into the mist as they struggled on the frozen ground. "Dad!" I screamed as I ran toward the door. But before I could reach him, Dad shouted back at me, "Stay inside! Lock the door!" "No," Mom cried as she tried to pull me back inside. Dad looked at us one last time before shoving Kevin off of him and standing up shakily. His face was pale but determined as he grabbed a large branch from the ground and held it like a weapon. "I'll lead him away," Dad said quickly. "You two get out of here." "Jack," Mom sobbed as she clung to me tightly. "Don't do this." "I have to," Dad said firmly, his voice breaking slightly. "I won't let him hurt you." Before we could stop him, Dad turned and ran into the mist, shouting Kevin's name to draw him away from us. For a moment, everything was silent again except for Mom's sobs and my own shaky breathing, and then we heard them. The sounds of footsteps running through the forest, followed by a deep growl that didn't sound human at all. We waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before Mom finally pulled herself together enough to grab my arm and drag me back inside the RV. "We have to go," she said urgently as she slammed the door shut behind us. "But what about Dad?" I whispered through tears. Mom didn't answer me. She just grabbed the keys from where Dad had left them and started up the RV engine. The fallen tree was still blocking the road ahead of us, but Mom didn't care anymore. She hit the gas pedal hard and drove straight toward it without hesitation. The RV crashed through part of it with a loud crack before skidding onto another dirt path beyond it, and just like that, we were out of there. As Jack disappeared into the mist with Kevin chasing him, Lisa held her mother tightly and whispered, "Dad saved us." The RV rattled and groaned as Mom drove it down the narrow dirt path. The mist was still thick, but she didn't slow down. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, trying to see through the fog, but all I could see were blurry shapes of trees rushing past us. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you think Dad?" "Don't," she cut me off sharply, her voice breaking. "Don't say it." I bit my lip and looked down at my hands. They were shaking so badly that I had to clench them into fists to make them stop. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe properly. All I could think about was Dad, how he'd run into the mist to save us, how he'd looked back at us one last time before disappearing. The RV hit a bump, jolting us both forward. Mom cursed under her breath but kept driving. The road was rough and uneven, and the trees seemed to close in on us from both sides. "Where are we going?" I asked quietly. "Anywhere but here," she replied without looking at me. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. The mist started to thin out little by little until I could finally see more of the forest around us. The trees looked less twisted now, more normal, but the cold still clung to everything. Finally, we saw a small wooden sign ahead. Ranger's Station. 2 miles. Mom let out a shaky breath and pressed harder on the gas pedal. When we reached the station, it was a small building with a single light glowing above the door. Mom parked the RV haphazardly in front of it and jumped out without even turning off the engine. I followed her as she banged on the door with both fists. "Help!" she shouted. "Please, we need help." A man in a ranger uniform opened the doctor a moment later, looking startled. "Ma'am, what's going on?" Mom grabbed his arm desperately. "My son is missing. My husband. He's still out there. Please, you have to help us." The ranger's expression softened as he guided us inside. Okay. Calm down," he said gently. "We'll figure this out." The inside of the station was warm and smelled like coffee. There were maps pinned to the walls and a radio crackling softly on a desk. The ranger sat us down and handed Mom a cup of water. "Start from the beginning," he said. Mom tried to explain what had happened, the mist, Kevin disappearing, Dad running off, but her words came out jumbled and frantic. She kept looking at me for support, but I didn't know what to say either. "It wasn't just normal," I finally said quietly. "There was something out there in the woods. Something wrong." The ranger frowned slightly but didn't interrupt me. He just nodded like he was trying to make sense of what we were saying. When we finished telling him everything, he leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. "I've worked here for 20 years, he said slowly, "and I've heard some strange stories about this area. But nothing like this." "You don't believe us?" Mom said flatly. "I didn't say that," he replied quickly. "But it's hard to explain something like this without seeing it for myself. Mom shook her head and buried her face in her hands. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It's not just Kevin. It's something else out there." The ranger stood up and grabbed his radio. "I'll call for backup," he said firmly. "We'll send out a search party first thing in the morning." But morning felt so far away. That night, they let us stay in one of the back rooms at the station while they prepared for the search. Mom lay on one of the cots with her back to me, clutching Kevin's jacket tightly against her chest like it was all she had left of him. I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness beyond the station's light. The mist had cleared up for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't gone. It was waiting. And then I noticed something strange. Frost patterns forming on the glass. They spread slowly across the windowpane like icy veins crawling outward from an invisible source. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at them, unable to look away. "Mom," I whispered urgently, "come look at this." She didn't respond. She was already asleep or pretending to be. I turned back toward her and froze. Her hand, the one clutching Kevin's jacket, was pale and stiff like ice had started forming beneath her skin. "Mom?" I said louder this time as I rushed over to her side. She stirred slightly but didn't wake up fully. Her breathing sounded shallow now, ragged, and when I touched her arm, it felt cold as stone. "No," I whispered shakily as tears filled my eyes. "No, no." I didn't know what to do, whether to wake someone or run or scream. But deep down, I knew what was happening. Whatever had taken Kevin was taking her too. Lisa stared at her mother's hospital window as frost patterns began forming on the glass. It's been nearly 20 years since that night in the Ozarks, but I still think about it every single day. My name is Lisa Miller, and I'm the only one left. After we escaped to the ranger station, my mom didn't recover. The frostbite-like markings on her skin spread quickly and her hunger grew unbearable. She barely spoke, barely moved, and when she did, it was like she wasn't herself anymore. The doctors said it was hypothermia or shock from trauma, but I knew the truth. I saw the frost patterns on her hospital window every night, growing like vines. I saw the way her eyes started to change, how they reflected light just like Kevin's had. She passed away 2 weeks later. The official cause was organ failure, but I knew better. Whatever had taken Kevin had taken her too. After that, I was placed in foster care. No one believed my story about what happened in the woods. Not the rangers, not the doctors, not even my foster parents. They said it was grief and stress making me imagine things. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there. For years, I tried to move on. I finished school, got a job, and tried to live a normal life. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, it always came back. The mist, the hunger, the antlers. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and swear I could hear Kevin's voice calling my name from somewhere far away. And then there were the letters. The first one arrived on my 18th birthday. It was a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with a child's drawing on it, an RV surrounded by trees and mist. Standing next to the RV was a tall figure with antlers, and beside it was a smaller figure holding its hand. At the bottom of the page were 3 words written in shaky handwriting. Still hungry. Love. Kevin. I burned the letter immediately, but more kept coming, always with drawings of that same antlered figure and messages signed by Kevin. Sometimes they'd arrive months apart, sometimes years. But every time I opened one, it felt like he was closer, and now he is. Last night I saw a news report about hikers disappearing in Devil's Backbone, the same place we were trapped all those years ago. The reporter said their campsite had been found abandoned with strange carvings on nearby trees. Carvings of antlers. I knew what it meant. I don't know why this thing chose my family or why it keeps calling me back, but I can't ignore it anymore. If I don't stop it now, it'll keep spreading, taking more people like it took Kevin and Mom and Dad. So here I am, sitting in my car with a rifle beside me and a map of Devil's Backbone spread out on the passenger seat. The mist is already rolling in as I drive deeper into the forest, but this time, I'm not running away. This time, I'm going to end it. Lisa loaded her rifle and stepped outside into the cold night air. She was ready to end this once and for all. My name is Harold Jenkins. I'm 52 years old, a Korean War veteran, and if I'm being honest, not the man I used to be. The war took something from me, something I can't quite put into words, and left me with a mind that doesn't always feel like my own. My wife, Martha, says this trip will help me reconnect with life outside the battlefield. I don't know if she's right, but I agreed to it because she deserves better than the shell of a man I've become. We left Chicago early last week, driving west in our brand new Chevrolet Bel Air, pulling the shiny silver Airstream trailer behind us. Martha was excited about the trip. She called it our big adventure. Me? I wasn't so sure. The desert never felt welcoming to me. But Martha said Echo Canyon was supposed to be beautiful. She'd read about it in some travel magazine and couldn't stop talking about the red rock formations and ancient Navajo carvings. The drive was long and quiet. Martha tried to make conversation, but I wasn't much for talking. The further we got into Arizona, the hotter it became. The air felt heavy, and the landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, just sand, rocks, and scrubby bushes as far as the eye could see. It reminded me of places I'd rather forget. We stopped at a gas station in a small town about an hour from Echo Canyon. It was one of those rundown places with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. While Martha filled up the car, I went inside to pay. The man behind the counter was old, his face weathered like leather, and he didn't say much until he saw where we were headed. "Echo Canyon?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "You sure about that?" I frowned at him. "Why wouldn't we be?" He leaned forward on the counter, his eyes narrowing. "Not many folks go out there anymore. Place has stories." "Stories?" I repeated. He nodded slowly but didn't elaborate. Martha walked in just then, cheerful as ever, and asked if they sold maps of the area. The old man didn't answer her right away. He just stared at me like he wanted to say something more but thought better of it. "Y'all be careful," he finally muttered as we left. I didn't think much of his warning at the time, just another superstitious local trying to spook tourists. But as we drove closer to Echo Canyon, something about his words stuck with me. We reached the entrance to Echo Canyon just as the sun was starting to dip low in the sky. The light turned everything a deep orange, and the shadows from the towering red rocks stretched long across the ground. It was beautiful, sure, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. Martha didn't seem to notice. She was leaning out the passenger window, pointing at the rock formations and talking about how she couldn't wait to set up camp. I nodded along, trying to focus on her voice instead of the strange feeling creeping up my spine. The road into the canyon was narrow and winding, with steep cliffs on one side and jagged rocks on the other. I kept both hands tight on the wheel, my eyes glued to the road ahead. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere there was a loud clang and a hard jolt that nearly sent us off the edge of the cliff. The steering wheel jerked in my hands and I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, sending up a cloud of dust. "What was that?" Martha asked, her voice sharp with panic. I didn't answer right away. My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely think. I threw open my door and got out to check. The Airstream trailer had somehow come unhitched from the car. It was sitting at an angle behind us, its back end dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. "How in the world?" I muttered to myself as I walked over to inspect it. The hitch wasn't broken. It looked like someone had unlatched it on purpose, but that didn't make any sense. No one had touched it since we left the gas station. "Is everything okay?" Martha called from inside the car. "Yeah," I lied, not wanting to worry her more than she already was. I managed to reattach the trailer and double-checked that everything was secure before getting back in the car. Martha looked at me with concern but didn't press me for answers. She knew me well enough to know when something was bothering me, but she also knew better than to push too hard. We drove the rest of the way in silence. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun had dipped below the horizon and the sky was turning a deep shade of purple. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath, trying to shake off what had just happened. Maybe it was just bad luck, a bump in the road or something I hadn't noticed while driving. But as I walked around to check on the trailer again, something caught my eye. There were scratches along one side of its shiny silver surface, long, deep gouges that definitely hadn't been there before. Martha came up behind me and gasped when she saw them. "What do you think caused that?" "Probably some branches," I said quickly, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. There weren't any trees near where we'd stopped earlier, just rocks and dirt. Martha frowned but didn't argue. "Well, let's not let it ruin our trip," she said after a moment, forcing a smile. "Come on, let's get everything set up." I nodded and followed her lead, but as we unpacked our things and set up camp under the stars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. The campsite was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, you'd expect to hear crickets or the occasional rustle of leaves in a place like this. But here, there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind whistling through the canyon and the faint hum of our trailer's generator. Martha didn't seem to notice. She was busy unpacking, humming softly to herself as she set up our folding chairs and picnic table. I tried to focus on helping her, but my mind kept drifting back to those scratches on the trailer. They didn't look natural. They were too deep, too deliberate. "Harold," Martha said suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Can you grab the cooler from the car?" "Yeah, sure," I mumbled, walking over to the Bel Air. As I opened the trunk, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I froze and turned slowly toward the edge of the campsite. There, standing just beyond the glow of our lanterns, was a coyote. It was staring at me, its yellow eyes reflecting the light like two tiny flames. At first, I thought it was just curious. Wild animals sometimes wander close to campsites looking for food. But then, it did something that sent a chill down my spine. It stood up, not fully upright like a person, but enough that it looked unnatural. Its front legs hung awkwardly in front of its body, and its head tilted slightly to one side as if it were studying me. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it dropped back down on all fours and disappeared into the darkness. "Harold?" Martha called from behind me. "Are you okay?" I turned back toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah," I lied again. "Just thought I saw something." She frowned but didn't press me further. I carried the cooler over to her and sat down in one of the folding chairs while she started preparing dinner. The smell of canned chili filled the air, but I barely noticed it. My mind was racing. I wanted to tell Martha about what I'd seen. The scratches, the coyote, but every time I opened my mouth, the words got stuck in my throat. She'd just tell me I was imagining things or blame it on my war nerves. And maybe she'd be right. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I didn't believe that. After dinner, we sat together under the stars for a while. Martha talked about how beautiful the canyon was and how much she loved being out here with me. I nodded along, but barely heard her words. My eyes kept darting to the shadows around us, looking for any sign of movement. Eventually, Martha decided to turn in for the night. She kissed me on the cheek and climbed into the trailer while I stayed outside for a little longer. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying with it a strange sound, like whispers echoing off the canyon walls. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't random noise. It sounded like voices, low and distant, but unmistakable. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was my own voice. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The sound of my own voice, faint but clear, was coming from somewhere, deep in the canyon. It wasn't just random words either. It was a conversation I didn't remember having. "Do you think this trip will help?" the voice said. It sounded exactly like me, down to the slight rasp in my tone. Another voice answered, softer but just as familiar. It was Martha's voice. "I hope so. He hasn't been himself since he came back." I froze in place, my heart hammering in my chest. Those were our voices, mine and Martha's. But we hadn't said those things. Not out loud, anyway. The whispers grew louder, bouncing off the canyon walls like they were coming from all directions at once. I stood up slowly, scanning the darkness around me, but I couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of our lanterns. "Harold?" Martha's voice called again, this time from inside the trailer. "Are you coming to bed?" I turned toward the airstream and saw her standing in the doorway, her silhouette outlined by the warm light inside. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. Whatever I'd heard must have been some kind of trick of the wind, an echo or something. But then I noticed something strange. Martha's lips weren't moving. Her voice called out again, clear as day. "Harold? What are you doing out there?" But she wasn't speaking. She was just standing there, staring at me with a puzzled look on her face. I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me. Did you just say something?" I managed to ask. She shook her head. "No." "Why?" Before I could answer, the whispering voices stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence that felt even heavier than before. Martha frowned and stepped down from the trailer, walking over to me. "Harold," she said gently, placing a hand on my arm, "you're shaking. What's wrong?" I opened my mouth to tell her about the voices, but stopped myself. She wouldn't believe me. Not really. And even if she did, what could she do about it? Instead, I shook my head and forced a weak smile. "Nothing," I said quietly. "Just tired." She didn't look convinced, but didn't push me further. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's get some sleep." I nodded and followed her into the trailer, locking the door behind us. Martha climbed into bed almost immediately, but I stayed up for a while longer, sitting at the small table with a flashlight and staring out the window. The canyon outside was pitch black now, except for the faint glow of moonlight on the rocks. Every shadow looked like it was moving, and every gust of wind sounded like footsteps just outside the door. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I crawled into bed beside Martha. She was already asleep, her breathing slow and steady. I closed my eyes and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine in the morning, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, the sun rose over Echo Canyon, casting long shadows across the red rocks. Martha woke up cheerful, as always, and started making coffee on the small stove in the trailer. I didn't sleep much. My mind was still racing from what I'd heard the night before, but I didn't say anything to her. Not yet. After breakfast, Martha decided she wanted to explore the area. "I read there's a spring nearby," she said, tying her hair back into a ponytail. "Maybe we can refill our water bottles." I wasn't thrilled about wandering around, but I didn't want to dampen her mood. She seemed so excited about the trip, and I didn't want my unease to ruin it for her. We walked together through the canyon, following a narrow trail that wound between the towering rock formations. The air was dry and hot, and every step kicked up a cloud of dust. Martha kept stopping to take pictures of the petroglyphs carved into the rocks, ancient symbols left behind by the Navajo people. "They're beautiful," she said, tracing her fingers over one of the carvings. "Can you imagine how old these must be?" I nodded, but didn't say much. My eyes kept darting to the shadows around us, looking for any signs of movement. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It had only gotten stronger. As we rounded a bend in the trail, We came across an old man sitting on a flat rock near the path. He was wearing faded jeans and a plaid shirt with a wide-brimmed hat shading his face from the sun. At first glance, he looked like any other local out for a walk, but there was something about him that felt different. "Good morning," Martha said cheerfully as we approached. The man looked up slowly and nodded in response. His face was lined with deep wrinkles and his eyes were dark and piercing, like they could see right through you. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Suddenly, his voice low and steady, Martha frowned. "Excuse me?" "This canyon," he continued, gesturing to the rocks around us. "It's not safe." I felt my stomach tighten at his words. "What do you mean?" I asked. The man sighed and shook his head. "Bad things happened here long ago," he said quietly. "Things that left scars, not just on this land but on those who come here." Martha glanced at me nervously before turning back to the man. "What kind of bad things?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "A massacre," he said finally. "Years ago, soldiers came through here and killed everyone they found. Men, women, children. They left their bodies to rot in the sun." Martha gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. I felt a chill run down my spine. "The spirits of those who died here don't rest," the man continued, "and there are others, things older than this land itself, that feed on their pain." "What kind of things?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man looked directly at me then, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Skin walkers," he said simply. Martha frowned in confusion. "What's a skinwalker?" the man explained slowly, his voice heavy with warning. He told us about ancient Navajo legends, about creatures that could take on human forms or mimic voices to lure their victims into traps. He said they fed on fear and grief and were drawn to people who carried heavy burdens. I felt my chest tighten as he spoke. His words hit too close to home, like he knew exactly what kind of weight I'd been carrying since the war. "You should leave," he said finally, standing up from his rock and brushing off his jeans. "Before it's too late." Martha tried to ask him more questions, but he just shook his head and walked away down the trail without another word. We stood there in silence for a long moment after he left. "Do you think he was serious?" Martha asked quietly. I nodded, slowly, my throat dry. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think he was." We decided to head back to camp after meeting the old man. Martha was quieter than usual, her cheerful energy replaced by a nervous edge. I didn't blame her. His warning had shaken us both. The canyon, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt like it was closing in around us. By the time we got back to the trailer, the sun was high in the sky, and the heat was unbearable. Martha suggested we take a break and wait for the temperature to drop before doing anything else. I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we needed to leave. Now. "Let's pack up tonight," I said as we sat in the shade of the trailer. "First thing in the morning, we'll head out." Martha looked at me with concern but nodded. "Okay," she said softly, "if that's what you want." I could tell she didn't want to leave. She'd been looking forward to this trip for months, but she trusted me enough not to argue. Later that afternoon, Martha decided to refill our water bottles at the spring we'd passed earlier. "I'll be quick," she said, grabbing the empty bottles and slinging them over her shoulder. "I'll come with you," I offered, standing up. She smiled and shook her head. "It's fine, Harold. You look like you need some rest." I hesitated, but eventually sat back down. She was right. I felt drained, like all the energy had been sucked out of me. "Don't take too long," I said as she walked away. "I won't," she called over her shoulder. I watched her disappear down the trail, her figure growing smaller and smaller until it was swallowed by the canyon's shadows. For a while, I sat there in silence, staring at the horizon and listening to the wind whistle through the rocks. But as minutes turned into an hour, I started to feel uneasy. Martha should have been back by now. I stood up and called her name, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Martha!" No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking down the trail toward the spring. The shadows were longer now, stretching across the ground like dark fingers reaching for me. The further I went, the quieter it became. No wind, no footsteps, nothing. When I reached the spring, my stomach dropped. The water bottles were lying on the ground near the edge of the pool, but Martha was nowhere to be seen. Her scarf, the one she always wore when hiking, was caught on a cactus nearby, fluttering gently in the breeze. "Martha!" I shouted again, my voice cracking with panic. Still nothing. I searched everywhere, behind rocks, under bushes, but there was no sign of her. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. That's when I heard it. Her voice. Harold? It was, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the canyon. I turned toward the sound and started running, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. "Martha, where are you?" "Over here." Her voice called again, closer this time. Followed it blindly, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I rounded a corner in the trail, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was no one there, just rocks and shadows, and something else. Footprints. But they weren't normal footprints. They were strange and misshapen, with only 3 toes on each foot. My blood ran cold as I stared at them. They led away from me into a narrow crevice between 2 towering rocks. "Harold?" Martha's voice called again from inside the crevice. But this time, something about it felt wrong. I stood frozen at the entrance to the crevice, staring into the darkness. Martha's voice had sounded close, but something about it wasn't right. It was too calm, too steady, like she wasn't scared or confused, just waiting. "Harold?" Her voice called again, softer this time. "Come here." My gut told me not to move, but my heart wouldn't let me leave her. I stepped forward cautiously, shining my flashlight into the narrow gap between the rocks. The beam barely reached the back of the crevice, and all I could see were jagged walls and shadows. "Martha?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I took another step forward, my boots crunching against the gravel. The air felt colder here, like I'd stepped into a different world entirely. My flashlight flickered for a moment before steadying again. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. There she was, Martha, standing at the edge of the trail with her scarf still tied neatly around her neck. She looked calm, almost too calm, and there wasn't a single scratch or speck of dirt on her clothes. "Where did you go?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I got lost," she said simply, her tone flat. "But I'm okay now." Something about her answer didn't sit right with me. Martha never got lost. She had an excellent sense of direction and always carried a map with her. And why hadn't? She called for help earlier. I stepped closer to her, shining the flashlight on her face. She blinked against the light and raised a hand to shield her eyes. "Harold," she said softly. "What's wrong?" I stared at her for a long moment, searching for something, anything that felt familiar about her. But it wasn't just her tone that seemed off. It was everything. The way she stood perfectly still, the way she smiled without showing any teeth, the way her eyes didn't quite meet mine. "I thought you were in the crevice," I said finally. She tilted her head slightly to one side, like she didn't understand what I meant. "I wasn't," she said simply. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it a faint whisper that sent chills down my spine. I glanced over my shoulder toward the crevice but saw nothing. When I turned back to Martha, she was closer than before. Too close. And I hadn't seen her move. "Let's go back to camp," she said softly, reaching for my hand. Her touch was cold, so cold it felt like ice against my skin, and I pulled away instinctively. She frowned at me but didn't say anything else. As we walked back to camp together, I couldn't stop glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. She moved differently now. Her steps were stiff and awkward as if she wasn't used to walking. On two legs. And every time I tried to start a conversation with her, she answered in short sentences that didn't sound like her at all. When we reached the trailer, Martha climbed inside without hesitation and started unpacking some canned food for dinner. She hummed softly as she worked, a tune that sounded familiar but wrong, somehow, like it was missing notes or played backward. I sat down outside the trailer and stared at the ground beneath my feet. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were hers, but they weren't normal footprints either. They were misshapen with 3 toes on each foot, the same ones I'd seen near the crevice earlier. I felt my chest tighten as realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't Martha. I sat outside the trailer, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the strange footprints. They were unmistakable. 3 toes, long and clawed, pressed deep into the dirt. I looked up at the trailer door, where Martha was humming softly inside, and felt a wave of dread wash over me. This wasn't her. Whatever had come back from the canyon wasn't my wife. I stood up slowly, trying to keep my movements quiet. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I confront her? Run? But where would I go? The canyon stretched for miles, and the nearest town was hours away. Martha? I called hesitantly, my voice shaking. The humming stopped abruptly. She stepped out of the trailer, holding 2 plates of canned chili in her hands. Her smile was wide, but didn't reach her eyes. "Dinner's ready," she said cheerfully, like nothing was wrong. I forced myself to nod and took one of the plates from her, though my hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. She sat down across from me at the folding table and started eating without saying a word. I watched her closely as she ate. Her movements were smooth and deliberate, almost too perfect, like she was mimicking what a person should look like while eating. And then I noticed something else. She wasn't blinking. Not once since she'd sat down had she blinked. Her yellowish eyes stayed fixed on me, unblinking and unnerving. I put my plate down and cleared my throat. "You seem different," I said carefully. She tilted her head slightly, her smile never faltering. "Different how?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "You're quieter than usual," she laughed softly, a sound that felt hollow and wrong. "You're imagining things," she said lightly. "You've been stressed lately." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. They weren't just dismissive, they were calculated. She was trying to make me doubt myself, to make me think I was losing my mind. "I need some air," I said abruptly, standing up from the table. She didn't stop me or ask questions. She just kept smiling as she watched me walk away toward the edge of the campsite. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to my flashlight as I scanned the ground for more footprints. That's when I saw it. Something glinting in the dirt near a cluster of rocks at the edge of camp. I crouched down and picked it up, my stomach sinking as I realized what it was. Martha's wedding ring. She never took it off, not even when washing dishes or hiking. The sight of it lying there in the dirt confirmed what I already knew. This thing wasn't her. I turned back toward the trailer slowly, gripping the flashlight tightly in my hand like a weapon. Martha was standing in the doorway now, watching me with that same unblinking stare. "Find something interesting?" she asked casually. Her voice sent chills down my spine. It sounded like Martha's, but lacked any warmth or familiarity. It was cold and empty, like an echo of something that had died long ago. "Where is she?" I demanded, stepping closer to her. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head again and smiled wider than before, too wide for any human mouth to manage. "Why don't you come inside?" she said softly. "We can talk about it." I froze in place, every instinct screaming at me not to move. Closer, Her yellow eyes glinted in the dim light of the lanterns, and for a brief moment, her face seemed to shift, her features blurring and warping like they couldn't hold their shape. That's when I knew for certain what this thing was, a skinwalker. I stood frozen, staring at the thing in the doorway. It wore Martha's face, but I knew now it wasn't her. The way it moved, the way it spoke, it was all wrong. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I was alone, unarmed, and trapped in a canyon miles away from anyone who could help. "Where is she?" I asked again, my voice trembling. The thing tilted its head, the too wide smile still plastered on its face. "She's here," it said softly, its voice almost mocking. "She's part of me now." I felt my stomach churn at its words. Part of it? What did that mean? I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I had to stop it, somehow. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep it talking while I thought of a plan. It stepped down from the trailer and started walking toward me slowly, its movements unnaturally smooth. "You brought me here," it said simply. "Your fear, your grief, they called to me." I backed away as it approached, gripping my flashlight tightly in one hand. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "You're not real," I said, more to myself than to it. "You're just a story." It laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "I'm as real as your pain," it said, "and I'm not done with you yet." Before I could react, it lunged at me. I stumbled backward and swung the flashlight as hard as I could, hitting it across the face. The impact made a sickening crack, but the thing barely flinched. Its face twisted then, shifting and warping until it no longer looked like Martha at all. Its skin stretched and tore, revealing something monstrous underneath. Yellow eyes that glowed in the dark, sharp teeth that glinted like knives. I turned and ran. My legs felt like lead as I sprinted through the canyon, the flashlight beam bouncing, wildly in front of me. Behind me, I could hear the thing chasing me, its footsteps heavy and uneven, like it wasn't used to running on two legs. "Harold," it called in a sing-song voice that sent chills down my spine. "You can't run forever." I didn't look back. My only thought was to get as far away from it as possible. The narrow trail twisted and turned between the rocks, and every shadow looked like something waiting to grab me. Then I saw it, a narrow opening in the canyon wall up ahead. It looked like a small cave or crevice, just big enough for me to squeeze into. Without thinking, I dove inside and pressed myself against the cold stone walls. The footsteps stopped outside. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard its voice again, soft and taunting. "Harold, come out, wherever you are." I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. My hands were shaking so badly that the flashlight slipped from my grip and clattered to the ground. The noise echoed through the canyon like a gunshot. The thing laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. "Found you," it said. I grabbed a rock from the ground and gripped it tightly in my hand as the creature stepped into view at the entrance of the crevice. Its yellow eyes glowed brightly in the darkness, and its twisted face stretched into a horrifying grin. This was it, my only chance. With every ounce of strength I had left, I hurled the rock at the ceiling of the crevice above its head. The impact sent a shower of loose rocks tumbling down around us. The creature screamed, a high-pitched wail that echoed off the canyon walls as the rocks collapsed on top of it. Dust filled the air, choking me as I scrambled out of the crevice and back onto the trail. I didn't stop running until I reached our campsite again. When I reached the campsite, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. My chest burned, my legs felt like jelly, and my mind was racing with everything that had just happened. The Airstream trailer stood there, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I forced myself to stand and staggered toward the trailer. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, half expecting that thing to be waiting for me inside. But the trailer was empty. The small table was still set with the plates of chili we hadn't finished. Martha's sweater was draped over the back of her chair, and her favorite book lay open on the bed. It looked so normal, so ordinary, that for a brief moment I let myself believe it had all been a nightmare. Then I saw the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable. 3-toed tracks leading from the trailer to the edge of the campsite. My stomach turned as I followed them with my flashlight, each step bringing me closer to the truth I didn't want to face. The tracks stopped near a cluster of rocks at the edge of camp, and there, half hidden in the shadows, I found her. Martha. She was lying on her side, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Her skin was pale and cold to the touch, and her eyes stared blankly into the night sky. But what struck me most was her face. It wasn't fully hers anymore. Her features were distorted, almost like they were caught halfway between human and something else. I dropped to my knees beside her, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch her cheek. "Martha," I whispered, my voice breaking. She didn't respond. She couldn't respond. I stayed there for what felt like hours, holding her lifeless body and trying to make sense of what had happened. The woman I'd loved, my wife, my partner, was gone, and whatever had taken her place, it wasn't human. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing still out there somewhere. I carried Martha's body back to the trailer and laid her gently on the bed before grabbing a notebook from one of the drawers. If no one ever found me, or if that thing came back, I wanted someone to know what had happened here. Wrote everything down. The voices in the canyon, the scratches on the trailer, the old man's warning, and how Martha disappeared. I wrote about how she came back wrong and how I'd seen through its disguise too late. And then I wrote about what I'd done, how I'd trapped it in that crevice with a rock slide. At least, I hoped I'd trapped it. As I finished writing, a strange calm washed over me. Maybe it was exhaustion or shock. I didn't know. But for the first time since we arrived at Echo Canyon, my mind felt clear. I closed the notebook and placed it on the table where someone would find it if they ever came looking for us. Then, I stepped outside one last time to look at the canyon under the moonlight. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the camp was a figure, a man wearing clothes just like mine. His face was hidden in shadow, but as he stepped closer, I saw his eyes, glowing yellow in the dark. It wasn't trapped. It had taken my form now. My name is Margaret Rossi, and I've always thought of myself as a practical woman. I was a nurse before I became a full-time mother, and I've always believed in keeping my family safe above all else. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the spring of 1965, when my husband's curiosity led us into the heart of Hollow Creek, West Virginia. Anthony, my husband, is a geology professor at West Virginia University. He's passionate about his work, sometimes too passionate. When he told me he wanted to study the geological aftermath of a mining disaster that happened decades ago, I didn't think much of it at first. He said it would be a good chance for us to spend time together as a family while he worked, and he'd even bought a shiny new Airstream RV to make the trip more comfortable. Our twin boys, Thomas and Timothy, were thrilled about the adventure. They're 10 years old, bright, curious, and full of energy. Thomas is quieter and more sensitive, always carrying around rocks he finds interesting. Timothy is the opposite, bold and impulsive, always running ahead without thinking twice. Drive into Hollow Creek was beautiful but eerie. The hillsides were steep and covered in dense woods, and the heavy rains had left everything damp and muddy. As we got closer to the hollow, strange mists started rising from the ground like ghostly fingers reaching for the sky. Anthony was fascinated by it all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We arrived at the campsite near an old sealed mine entrance late in the afternoon. The caretaker, a wiry old man with a weathered face, gave us a long look before saying, "You folks sure you want to camp here? This place has been watched for years." When Anthony asked what he meant by watched, the man just shook his head and muttered something about leaving before dark. Anthony brushed off the warning with his usual scientific logic. "Superstition," he said as he set up his instruments, near the mine entrance. "People always make up stories to explain things they don't understand." I wasn't so sure. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, and even Timothy seemed quieter than usual as we explored the area. The boys found a rusty memorial plaque listing the names of 47 miners who had died in the collapse back in 1938. Thomas traced his fingers over the names while Timothy kicked at rocks nearby. Later that evening, I went into town to pick up some supplies at the general store while Anthony stayed behind with the boys. The locals were polite enough but grew quiet when I mentioned where we were camping. One man, a storekeeper named Elijah Williams, told me about the mining disaster but avoided eye contact when I asked if there was anything unusual about it. "Folks around here don't talk about it much," Elijah said finally, "but if you're smart, you'll pack up and leave before you see something you can't unsee." I returned to camp feeling uneasy but didn't say anything to Anthony. He'd only laugh it off as small-town superstition. That night was when things started getting strange. As we lay in bed inside the Airstream, I heard flapping sounds on the roof above us, like giant wings brushing against metal. Anthony got up to check but found nothing unusual. He said it was probably just a tarp coming loose in the wind. But what really shook me was what happened with Thomas and Timothy later that night. Both boys woke up screaming from nightmares at exactly the same time. They clung to me tightly, shaking, as they described their dreams. Being trapped underground in complete darkness while something watched them from afar with glowing red eyes. Anthony tried to calm them down, saying it was just their imaginations running wild because of what they'd seen earlier that day. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. Not for them to have identical dreams like that. As I held my boys close and listened to the rain pounding against our RV windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. That something was watching us from beyond those misty woods. And this was only our first night. The next morning, I woke up early to make breakfast. The rain had stopped, but the mist still hung low over the hollow like a blanket. Anthony was already outside, fiddling with his instruments near the mine entrance. He looked excited. He always did when he thought he was onto something. The boys were quieter than usual as they sat at the little table inside the RV, eating their cereal. Timothy kept glancing out the window toward the woods, and Thomas was hunched over a notebook, drawing. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" I asked Thomas, trying to lighten the mood. He hesitated before showing me his drawing. My breath caught when I saw it. A tall figure with massive wings and glowing red eyes standing near our campsite. "Where did you see this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I didn't see it," Thomas said softly. "I just felt it." Before I could say anything else, Timothy piped up from across the table. "I drew the same thing last night," he said. He grabbed his notebook and flipped to a page with an almost identical drawing. Same wings, same eyes, same eerie presence. I felt a chill run down my spine. The boys had never been able to explain things like this before, but they'd always had a strange connection, sometimes finishing each other's sentences or knowing what the other was thinking without speaking. This was different, though. This felt wrong. Anthony came back inside a little while later, looking puzzled but excited. "Something's not right with my readings," he said as he held up one of his instruments. "The ground here is giving off signals like it's hollow underneath us, like there's some kind of cavern system that doesn't match the old mining maps." I didn't know much about geology, but even I could tell he was fascinated by whatever he'd found. "Maybe it's just old tunnels," I suggested, hoping to steer him away from anything dangerous. "Maybe," Anthony said absent-mindedly, already lost in his thoughts. Later that day, while Anthony worked outside, I decided to clean up inside. The RV. As I was tidying up near the boys' bunks, I found something strange under Thomas's pillow. A small red feather that crumbled into ash when I touched it. I stared at the pile of ash in my hand for a long time before brushing it away, and deciding not to mention it to Anthony or the boys. He'd just dismiss it as nothing important, and I didn't want to scare Thomas or Timothy any more than they already were. That evening, things got even stranger. The lights in the RV started flickering, not like they were going out completely, but in patterns that felt deliberate somehow. At first, Anthony thought it was just an electrical issue caused by the damp weather, but then we heard voices coming through the radio. It wasn't music or static. It was faint whispers repeating the same words over and over. Collapse coming. Collapse coming. Anthony turned off the radio quickly and muttered something about interference from nearby power lines. But there weren't any power lines out here, not this deep in the hollow. By now, even Anthony couldn't deny that. Something strange was happening. He suggested we go into town again to see if Elijah Williams could shed some light on what we were experiencing. Elijah wasn't happy to see us when we walked into his store that evening. He gave us a hard look and sighed heavily when Anthony started asking questions about local legends and strange occurrences. "You're talking about the Watcher," Elijah said finally after a long silence. "It's been seen before every big disaster around here. The mine collapse in '38 wasn't the first time." "What is it?" I asked nervously. Elijah shook his head slowly. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's trying to warn people. Others say it brings death with it wherever it goes." He leaned forward and lowered his voice. "But if you've seen it, or if your boys have, you need to leave this place now." Anthony dismissed Elijah's warning as superstition again, but I could tell he wasn't as confident as before. Something about this place was getting under his skin, too. That night, after we returned to camp, both boys woke up again at exactly midnight. This time, not screaming, but walking silently toward the mine entrance like they were in a trance. Followed them outside in a panic and shone my flashlight on their faces. And that's when I saw their eyes reflecting red in the beam of light. I froze when I saw the boys' eyes glowing red in the flashlight beam. It wasn't like a reflection you'd see in an animal's eyes. It was brighter, almost unnatural, like two tiny embers burning in the dark. "Thomas? Timothy?" I whispered, my voice shaking. They didn't respond. They just stood there, staring blankly toward the mine entrance like they were being pulled by some invisible force. "Anthony!" I shouted, my panic rising. He came running out of the RV, still pulling on his jacket. When he saw the boys, he stopped in his tracks. "What are they doing?" he asked, his voice low and uneasy. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They just walked out here." Anthony knelt down in front of them and gently shook their shoulders. "Hey, wake up! What's going on?" The boys blinked a few times, and just like that, the glow in their eyes disappeared. They looked up at us, confused. "Why are we outside?" Thomas asked softly, rubbing his eyes. "You tell me," Anthony said, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. "What were you doing out here?" Timothy shrugged. "I don't remember," he said. "I was dreaming about the mine again. And then I woke up here." Anthony and I exchanged a worried glance before leading them back inside the RV. We didn't talk about it that night, not in front of the boys, but I could tell Anthony was starting to take things more seriously. The next morning, while the boys played quietly near the campsite, Anthony dove into his research with a new sense of urgency. He spent hours poring over old maps and geological records he'd brought with him, muttering to himself as he scribbled notes. Meanwhile, I decided to head back into town to see if I could learn more about this so-called Watcher. Elijah had been reluctant to talk before, but maybe he'd open up if I pressed him. When I walked into the general store, Elijah gave me a wary look but didn't say anything as I approached the counter. "I need to know more," I said firmly, "about the Watcher, about what's happening to my family." Elijah sighed and leaned on the counter. "You're not gonna like what you hear," he said. I don't care, I replied. Just tell me. He hesitated for a moment before finally speaking. The Watcher's been around these parts for as long as anyone can remember, he said. It shows up before disasters. Mine collapses, floods, fires, you name it. Some folks think it's trying to warn people. Others think it's what causes the disasters in the first place. And you? I asked quietly. Elijah shook his head. I don't know what it is, he admitted, but I do know this. When it shows up, bad things happen. He looked at me seriously then and added, If your boys are seeing it, or drawing pictures of it, you need to get out of here now. I left the store feeling more uneasy than ever, but still unsure of what to do next. Anthony wasn't going to leave without finishing his research, and I couldn't exactly drag him away, kicking and screaming. When I got back to camp, Anthony was waiting for me with an excited look on his face. You're not going to believe this, he said as he held up an old photograph he'd found among his papers. It was black and white and grainy, but there was no mistaking what it showed. A tall figure with wings standing near a group of miners. It's real, Anthony said breathlessly. This thing has been around for over a century, maybe longer. I stared at the photo in disbelief. It was one thing to hear stories about the Watcher. It was another thing entirely to see proof of its existence. That night, after we put the boys to bed, Anthony and I sat outside by the fire pit, talking quietly about what we'd learned. What do you think it wants? I asked him. I don't. No, he admitted. But whatever it is, it's tied to this place somehow. We sat in silence for a while after that, listening to the sounds of the woods around us, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and then something else. A low, humming sound filled the air, not loud, but deep enough that we could feel it vibrating in our chests. What is that? I whispered. Anthony shook his head slowly. I don't know, he said again. And then we saw them, the boys, standing at the edge of the woods near the mine entrance once more. Thomas! Timothy! I called out, my voice trembling. The boys stood at the edge of the woods, their backs to us, completely still. Anthony grabbed a flashlight and started toward them. Stay here, he said firmly, but I wasn't about to let him. Go alone. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. As we got closer, I noticed something strange. The boys weren't just standing there, they were whispering to each other in low voices. It wasn't their usual playful chatter. It sounded like a language I didn't recognize, harsh and guttural. Boys, Anthony said gently as he shone the flashlight on them. What are you doing out here? The moment the light hit them, they stopped whispering and turned to face us. Their eyes weren't glowing this time, but their expressions were blank, almost empty. We heard it, Thomas said softly. Heard what? I asked, kneeling down to their level. The ground, Timothy replied. It's talking. Anthony and I exchanged a worried glance. Come on, he said, taking each boy by the hand. Let's get back to the RV. We walked back in silence, the boys unusually quiet. Once we were inside, Anthony tried to distract them with a card game while I made tea, but I could tell his mind was racing. Mine was, too. Later that night, as we lay in bed, Anthony whispered to me in the dark. I think the mine is unstable, he said. The readings I've been getting, they don't make sense. It's like the whole area is sitting on a hollow foundation. What does that mean? I asked nervously. It means if there's another earthquake, everything could collapse, he said grimly. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, Anthony insisted on going back to the mine entrance to take more readings despite my protests. I need to understand what's happening here, he said as he packed up his equipment. Anthony, this isn't just about your research anymore, I argued. Something is wrong with this place, something we don't understand. I know, he said quietly, but if we leave now, we might never figure out what it is. I wanted to scream at him for being so stubborn, But before I could say anything else, Timothy ran up to us holding something in his hand. "Look what I found," he said excitedly. It was another red feather, long and glossy. But when Anthony reached out to touch it, it crumbled into ash just like the one I'd found earlier. "That's not normal," I said firmly, but Anthony just frowned and muttered something about mineral deposits causing strange reactions. By midday, dark clouds had started rolling in again, and the air felt heavy and oppressive. The boys stayed close to me while Anthony worked near the mine entrance, jotting down notes and muttering under his breath. Then it happened. The ground beneath us trembled violently, knocking me off my feet and sending Anthony's equipment crashing. To the ground, the boys screamed as trees swayed dangerously around us. "Earthquake!" Anthony shouted as he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the RV. The shaking lasted only a few seconds but felt like an eternity. When it finally stopped, everything was eerily quiet except for the distant sound of rocks tumbling near the mine entrance. Anthony ran toward the mine while I stayed behind with the boys, trying to calm them down. When he came back a few minutes later, his face was pale. "The seal on the mine entrance is cracked," he said breathlessly. "There's gas leaking out. It smells like sulfur." "We need to leave," I said immediately. But Anthony shook his head. "I can't leave yet. I need more data." "Are you serious?" I snapped. "This place isn't safe. What if there's another quake?" Before he could respond, Thomas spoke up from where he was sitting with Timothy. His voice was flat and emotionless. Not like him at all. "There will be another quake," he said simply. "What are you talking about?" Anthony asked, kneeling in front of him. Thomas looked up at him with wide eyes that seemed far older than his 10 years. "The ground told us," he said softly. Timothy nodded in agreement. "It's going to collapse." I felt a chill run down my spine as Anthony stared at them in disbelief. For once, he didn't have a logical explanation or a dismissive comment, just silence. That night was worse than any before it. As we packed up our belongings in preparation to leave first thing in the morning, the lights flickered again. Not randomly this time, but in deliberate patterns that felt like some kind of message we couldn't understand. And then it appeared. I was outside collecting firewood when I saw it. A massive figure standing at the edge of our campsite, its wings spread wide enough to block out part of the sky. Its glowing red eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I couldn't move or breathe. It didn't attack or make any sound. It just stood there watching me like it was waiting for something. When I finally found my voice, I screamed for Anthony, but by the time he came running out with a flashlight, it was gone. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rumbling, low and deep, like thunder rolling through the earth. At first, I thought it was another earthquake, but the ground wasn't shaking. It was something else. Anthony was already outside, pacing near the mine entrance with his equipment. The boys sat quietly at the table inside the RV, their faces pale and tired. They hadn't slept much, and neither had I. "We need to leave," I said firmly as I stepped outside to talk to Anthony. "I don't care about your research anymore. This place isn't safe." Anthony didn't look at me right away. He was staring at the cracked seal on the mine entrance, his brow furrowed. "In concentration. Something's happening down there," he said finally. "I can feel it." "Anthony," I said, grabbing his arm to get his attention, "please, we need to go." Before he could respond, the rumbling grew louder, and then the ground beneath us gave way. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. One moment we were standing near the RV. The next, we were falling as the earth opened up beneath us like a giant mouth swallowing everything in its path. When I came to, I was lying on cold, damp rock in near total darkness. My head was pounding and my arms and legs felt heavy, but I could move. "Anthony!" I called out weakly. "I'm here," he shouted from somewhere nearby. "Are you okay?" "I think so," I said, sitting up slowly. "Where are the boys?" "They're with me," Anthony said as he helped Thomas and Timothy climb out of a pile of debris. They looked shaken but unharmed. I glanced around and realized we were inside a massive cavern, part of the old mine that had collapsed during the earthquake. The Airstream RV had fallen with us and was now wedged between two large rocks, its shiny exterior dented and scratched, but still intact. "We need to get out of here," I said urgently as I helped Anthony gather the boys near the RV. "I know," Anthony replied, pulling out an old mining map from his backpack. "There should be an air shaft somewhere nearby. It's our best chance." The air inside the cavern was thick and heavy with the smell of sulfur, making it hard to breathe. The boys clung to me tightly as Anthony led us deeper into the mine, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. As we walked, Timothy suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "Look," he whispered. I followed his gaze and saw something that made my stomach drop. A cavern filled with strange objects scattered. Across the floor, rusted tools, broken lanterns, torn clothing, all covered in a fine layer of ash. "What is this?" I asked quietly. "It's a nest," Thomas said softly. "A nest?" Anthony repeated, frowning. Thomas nodded slowly. "It's where it lives." Before I could ask him what he meant, Timothy spoke up again. "It doesn't want to hurt us," he said simply. "What are you talking about?" Anthony asked sharply. Timothy turned to look at him with wide eyes that seemed far too wise for his age. "It's trying to help," he said. Anthony stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head in disbelief. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. But deep down, I believed them. We kept moving through the cavern until we reached a narrow tunnel that seemed to lead upward toward an air shaft. The boys were exhausted by this point, especially Timothy, who had started coughing from the toxic gases seeping into the mine. "We're almost there," Anthony said as he helped Timothy along, "just a little farther." But when we reached the base of the air shaft, it became clear that not all of us would make it out. The shaft was narrow and steep, too difficult for Timothy to climb in his weakened state. Anthony looked at me then with an expression I'll never forget, one of love and determination mixed with heartbreak. "You take Thomas and go," he said firmly. "I'll stay here with Timothy." "No," I protested immediately. "We're not leaving you behind." "You have to," Anthony said quietly but firmly. "I'll find another way out, I promise." Tears streamed down my face as I hugged him tightly one last time before helping Thomas climb into the shaft with me. As we reached the surface and scrambled out into daylight, another earthquake shook the ground beneath us, and when it stopped, Hollow Creek was gone. The moment Thomas and I crawled out of the air shaft, I collapsed onto the damp ground, gasping for air. The sunlight felt harsh after the darkness of the mine, but I didn't care. I was just grateful to be alive. Thomas clung to me tightly, his small body trembling. "Where's Dad?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't bring myself to answer. My heart ached as I looked back at the hole we'd just climbed out of, knowing Anthony and Timothy were still down there. I wanted to believe Anthony's promise that he'd find another way out, but deep down, I wasn't sure if that was possible. The ground beneath us was still unstable, trembling every now and then like it might give way again. I knew we had to move, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. "Mom," Thomas said suddenly, his voice sharp with fear. "Look." I turned to see what he was pointing at, and froze. There it was. The creature stood on a rocky ledge not far from us, its massive wings spread wide like a shadow against the sky. Its red eyes glowed brightly, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. I wanted to scream or run, but I couldn't move. It wasn't just fear holding me in place, it was something else, something deeper. It was like the creature was inside my head, showing me things I didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. In an instant, my mind was flooded with visions. Flashes of the hollow collapsing into itself, swallowing everything in its path. Images of miners trapped underground in darkness, And then, Anthony and Timothy, standing together in one of the mine's tunnels, their faces calm but distant. "It's showing you," Thomas whispered beside me, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "Showing me what?" I managed to choke out. "What's going to happen?" he said simply. The creature didn't move closer. It didn't need to. Its presence was overwhelming enough from where it stood. And, as much as I wanted to believe it was trying to harm us, something about it felt different. It wasn't threatening us. It was warning us. The visions shifted again, this time showing me a way out, a path through the woods that would lead Thomas and me to safety before the rest of the hollow collapsed completely. But there was no sign of Anthony or Timothy in that vision. "No," I said aloud, shaking my head as tears blurred my vision. "I can't leave them." The creature tilted its head slightly, almost like it understood my pain. Then it spread its wings wider and let out a low, mournful sound that echoed through the hollow. "Mom," Thomas said urgently, tugging on my arm, "we have to go." I looked at him, my sweet boy who had already been through so much, and knew he was right. If we stayed any longer, we might not make it out at all. With one last glance at the creature and the air shaft behind us, I grabbed Thomas's hand and started running toward the path the creature had shown me in my mind. The woods were dense and muddy from all the rain, making it hard to move quickly. Every step felt like a struggle as branches clawed at our clothes and roots threatened to trip us up. But we kept going, because we had no other choice. Behind us, I heard the sound of rocks crumbling and trees snapping as another earthquake shook the ground. The hollow was collapsing faster now, just like the visions had shown me. By the time we finally broke through the tree line and reached higher ground, I could barely stand from exhaustion. Thomas clung to me tightly as we watched from a distance, while Hollow Creek disappeared into itself, a massive sinkhole swallowing everything in its path until there was nothing left but silence. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, holding on to each other as tears streamed down our faces. "They're gone," Thomas whispered finally. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Anthony and Timothy would find their way back to us somehow, but I couldn't. Lie to him? Not after everything we'd been through. As we stood there in stunned silence, a shadow passed over us, large and dark against the pale sky. I looked up just in time to see the creature flying overhead one last time before disappearing into the distance. After the hollow collapsed, everything was quiet. Too quiet. It felt like the world had stopped moving, like we were standing in a place where time didn't exist anymore. Thomas clung to me, his face buried in my side. I held him tightly, staring at the massive sinkhole that had swallowed Hollow Creek. Whole. The airstream, the mine entrance, the woods, all of it was gone. "They're still down there," Thomas whispered after a long silence. I didn't know how to respond. My heart wanted to believe that Anthony and Timothy were alive somewhere beneath all that rubble, but my mind kept showing me the truth. There was no way anyone could survive something like this. "We have to keep moving," I said finally, my voice trembling. "We need to get help." Thomas nodded, his small hand gripping mine as we started walking away from the disaster site. The ground was uneven and muddy, making every step feel like a struggle. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep going, for Thomas's sake if not my own. As we climbed higher into the hills, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air felt heavy and charged with something I couldn't explain, like static electricity before a storm. "Mom," Thomas said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "What is it?" I asked, turning to look at him. He pointed toward the horizon, where a faint glow of red light was visible through the mist. "It's here," he said quietly. I didn't need to ask what he meant. I already knew. The creature was still watching us, even now. We kept moving until we reached an old dirt road, leading back toward town. By then, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. Thomas was exhausted, his steps growing slower with each passing minute. "Just a little farther," I told him, trying to sound reassuring even though I wasn't sure where we were going or what we'd find when we got there. But before we could take another step, the ground trembled again, this time more violently than before. I grabbed Thomas and pulled him off the road just as a massive crack split the earth in front of us. Rocks tumbled down the hillside and trees swayed dangerously in the wind. "Stay here," I shouted over the noise as I shielded Thomas with my body. When the shaking finally stopped, I looked up and froze. The creature was standing on a ridge above us, its wings folded tightly against its body, its glowing red eyes locked onto mine. And for a moment, I thought it might come closer, but instead, it spread its wings and let out another mournful cry that echoed through the hills. "What does it want?" Thomas asked softly. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think it's trying to help." Thomas looked up at me with wide eyes full of fear and hope all at once. "Do you think Dad and Timothy are okay?" he asked. I hesitated before answering. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but if they are, we'll find them." The creature tilted its head slightly as if it understood what I'd said, and then it turned away and disappeared into the mist. 5 years later, I found myself standing on the edge of what used to be Hollow Creek. It wasn't a hollow anymore. The collapse had turned the entire area into a lake, a deep, still body of water surrounded by steep hills and dense forest. Thomas stood beside me, now 15 years old and taller than I ever imagined he'd be. He still had that quiet, thoughtful look about him, but there was something else too, something deeper. He'd grown up faster than most kids his age, and I knew it was because of what we'd been through. We didn't talk much on the drive here. There wasn't much to say. Coming back to this place felt like reopening an old wound, but I needed to see it again. I needed to feel close to Anthony and Timothy, even if it was just for a moment. The lake was eerily calm, the surface like glass, reflecting the gray sky above. There were no birds chirping, no wind rustling through the trees, just silence. "Do you think they're still down there?" Thomas asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. I looked at him, unsure how to answer. Over the years, I'd told myself that Anthony and Timothy were gone, that they'd been lost in the collapse along with everything else. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. "I don't know," I said finally. "Maybe." Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the water. "I feel like they are," he said softly. "Like they're not gone. Not really." I didn't press him for more details. Thomas had always been sensitive to things other people couldn't see or understand, just like he and Timothy had been back then. As we stood there, something strange happened. The air around us grew colder, and a faint mist began to rise from the surface of the lake. It swirled and danced in patterns that didn't seem natural, almost as if it were alive. "Mom," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady but tense. "Do you see that?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The mist was thickening now, forming shapes that looked almost human, but not quite. And then I saw them. 2 figures standing in the mist near the center of the lake. One tall and broad-shouldered, the other smaller and slighter. They didn't move or speak. They just stood there, watching us. "Anthony," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "Timothy." Thomas stepped closer to the edge of the lake, his expression calm but focused. "They're trying to tell us something," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt down and placed his hand on the surface of the water as if he were listening to it. After a moment, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part sadness, part understanding. "They're not gone," he said simply. "They've changed." "Changed how?" I asked, struggling to make sense of what he was saying. "They're part of this place now," Thomas explained. part of whatever's down there. Before I could respond, a shadow passed over us, large and dark against the pale sky. I looked up just in time to see it. The creature flying low over the lake with its massive wings spread wide and its glowing red eyes fixed on us. It circled once before landing on a rocky outcrop near the water's edge. For a moment, it just stood there silently, its presence as overwhelming as ever. And then, something changed. The creature's eyes glowed, brighter than before. Not 2 red lights, but 4 now. And in their glow, I saw flashes of memories. Anthony laughing as he worked on his research. Timothy chasing Thomas through our backyard. All 4 of us sitting around a campfire on a warm summer night. It wasn't just showing me these memories. It was sharing them with me as if they were its own. Tears streamed down my face as I realized what it was trying to tell me. Anthony and Timothy weren't gone. They were part of this creature now, part of whatever force had been watching over Hollow Creek for centuries. "They're safe," Thomas said softly beside me. "There, with it." I reached out instinctively toward the creature as if touching it might bring me closer to them, but before I could get too close, it spread its wings and took off into the sky once more. As it disappeared into the distance, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. Not because everything made sense, it didn't, but because I knew Anthony and Timothy were still out there somewhere, watching over us just like the creature had always done for others before us. Thomas and I stood there for a long time after that, staring out at the lake in silence, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt like we weren't alone anymore.